In the early 90s, it was the post-Reagan era when the Bush administration began their attempts to roll back Roe v. Wade. The second-wave feminist movement of the 60s and 70s had largely faded out, and women began to integrate themselves into a post-feminist culture, entrenched in excuses for rape, racism, and victim blaming. Meanwhile, in Olympia, Washington, the underground feminist art punk scene was starting to see a surge in prominence that would eventually lead to a countercultural movement that would define a large portion of third-wave feminism. This was Riot Grrrl. The year was 1986. At Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, photography student Kathleen Hanna decided to curate a photo exhibit for an assignment with her good friend, Erin Bosch Green. The exhibit blatantly tackled sexism, HIV/AIDS, and domestic violence against women. However, the exhibit was taken down by the school's administration before it could be viewed. This particular incident would become what Kathleen Hanna refers to as her first foray into activism. She then went on to start a feminist art gallery called Reco Muse with her friends Heidi and Tammy Ray, and soon eventually began to dip her toes into writing and spoken word poetry. It wasn't until an encounter with her then hero Kathy Acker that Hanna would go into music. Kathleen Hanna was in two feminist punk rock bands called Amy Carter and Viva Knievel. Before returning from a North American tour with Viva Knievel, Hanna would write a complimentary letter to Toby Vale, the curator of a feminist art and music zine called Jigsaw, which Hanna was a devoted reader of, and the two decided to start a band. Vale had already picked a name which came across her radar several years beforehand, having played at an all-girl punk show that one of her ex-bandmates had booked at the Capitol Theater. When Vale asked her friend what she would name her new band, she answered either Bikini Kill or the Cradle Robbers. They ended up choosing Cradle Robbers, and Vale wrote a letter to her friend, claiming she would like the name Bikini Kill for herself. Vale and her good friend, Kathy Wilcox, had already spoken about starting a band, before enlisting Kathleen Hanna to be the lead singer and frontwoman. Vale played the drums and Wilcox played bass without any prior experience or knowledge. Part of the band may not have been trained musicians, but being skilled wasn't the point. Their music was a tool for activism, making a fuss, and starting a movement. The anthemic Rebel Girl and Double Daria are two of their most memorable tracks that derive influence from punk bands like X-Ray Spex. The band's first EP was produced by Ian Mackay of Fugazi and Minor Threat and distributed by the independent label Kill Rock Stars. Meanwhile, in the town of Eugene, Oregon, University of Oregon students Allison Wolfe and Molly Newman became fast friends, swapping their favorite music from lo-fi indie pop to R&B and rap. They traveled to Olympia together often to immerse themselves in the DIY punk rock scenes, which was where they met Hanna and Vale. Newman and Wolfe were inspired by Vale and her zine Jigsaw, and decided to create their own, Girl Germs, which they would use to interview local bands throughout the Pacific Northwest scene. The two eventually decided to start their own band, which they called Bratmobile. However, neither of them were trained musicians, nor had they ever written a song before. "We were a fake band. We were all talk," Allison told Sarah Marcus for the Riot Grrrl biography, Girls to the Front. It wasn't until they were invited by a mutual friend to play a Valentine's Day gig in Olympia that they were forced to put their talk to the test. consulting Robert Christie of Some Velvet Sidewalk and Oswald 5-0. They were told to listen to a Ramones record, and that would help them come up with a song. Wolf went on to say, "Something in me clicked. Like, okay, if most boy punk rock bands just listen to the Ramones, and that's how they write their songs, then we'll do the opposite, and we won't listen to any Ramones. That way we'll sound different." As Sarah Marcus wrote in Girls to the Front, in contrast to Bikini Kill's haunted, unhinged vision of childhood, Bratmobile's earliest songs heralded a carefree, guileless one. The term Riot Grrrl is said to have originated by Jen Smith, friend of Allison's and a punk scene stalwart who studied at the University of Maryland. On May 5th of 1991, a race riot broke out at Mount Pleasant in response to a Salvadorian immigrant being shot by the police. This was followed by the U.S. Supreme Court enforcing a gag rule that banned federally funded clinics from discussing or performing abortions. Smith wrote a letter to Allison discussing how she felt the need for a girl riot. This was around the same time Bikini Kill had relocated to D.C., where Kathleen Hanna had worked as a stripper to pay rent. And together, both bands started a zine, which they called Riot Grrrl, to pass out at shows and connect with other women. This would lead to community feminist meetings where they would all discuss topics ranging from domestic violence to homophobia, HIV/AIDS, abortion, and sexual abuse. Allison Wolf from Bratmobile and I took a clipboard to a verbal assault show and took down the numbers of girls and women who might be interested in hanging out and talking feminism, and we called our first meeting. This created a ripple effect that spread across the Pacific Northwest. Seeing Bratmobile perform inspired Corinne Tucker of Slater-Kinney and Heavens to Betsy to join the scene as well. Tucker interviewed Allison Wolf at a show, and Wolf relayed her disappointment in the sub-pop grunge scene, or as she called it, the sub-pop boy grunge grab your dick scene, and lamented the general toxicity of those shows where women were regularly assaulted and pushed to the back of the venue. This emboldened Hanna to regularly call all the girls at Bikini Kill's shows to the front of the stage.
All girls to the front. I'm not kidding.
The emergence of strong women in punk was nothing new, but a cultural feminist movement, the same magnitude as Riot Grrrl, was yet to happen. As Marcus continues in Girls to the Front, one would never know it by looking at the punk bands that made up the genre's canon in 1990 when Bikini Kill got started, like Black Flag, The Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. But the early history of punk rock was full of memorable women in the United States as well as Britain. New York had Patti Smith, Sonic Youth's Kim Gordon, and post-punk dance bands like Y-Pants and ESG. Even in Washington, D.C. in the early 80s, where the teenage band Minor Threat was seeding the shouty, sinewy, overwhelmed male hardcore sound, the all-female group Chalk Circle paid tribute to European bands like Kleenex and All Pairs. So it wasn't as if punk had always been a male-dominated domain, far from it. But as the 80s drew on, hardcore became the dominant sound of punk. The concert's mosh pits, flurries of flying elbows and wandering hands drove most girls to the sidelines, or out of the scene altogether. Documents of the Riot Grrrl movement are now archived at the NYU Fails Library, and Riot Grrrl may never have become a mainstream global movement that everybody remembers, but it did extend overseas, as we see with the English Riot Grrrl band Huggy Bear. Many people have the misconception that it was a certain time period and nothing more, but I strongly disagree. I would argue that the ability young women and girls now have to embrace the DIY approach to music would not be as prevalent as it is now had Riot Grrrl not busted down the door back in the 90s. The 90s DIY feminist art punk scene in the Pacific Northwest gave us Kurt Cobain, Ian MacKaye, and Slater-Kinney. And the list of bands in the Riot Grrrl legacy goes on, with bands like Babes in Toyland, Heavens to Betsy, L7, Calamity Jane, 7-Year Bitch, and even in more modern underground punk bands today like Skinny Girl Diet, Potty Mouth, Priests, and Childbirth. Kathleen Hanna's influence with projects like Bikini Kill, La Tigra, and the Julie Ruin has permeated the underground so much that it's hard to meet many young women in DIY scenes even today who don't cite her as an influence. With underground pop acts like Sizzy Rocket, and even R&B powerhouses like Sid the Kid citing Hanna as some of their inspirations. Popular opinion may view Riot Grrrl as relegated to a certain place and time, but that's not to say that it isn't fondly remembered and didn't open the door for many other women in music to do whatever the fuck they want without feeling persecuted or having to answer to men. And that's huge, and that's why we must preserve the history. Long live the Revolution Girl style now.